In a single night, over 10,000 people died. 13 Royal Navy warships vanished beneath the sea. Entire towns were torn apart. Windmills burned. Cows were found hanging in trees. Even the Queen was forced to flee for her life. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a war. It was a storm. The deadliest natural disaster in British history. The Great Storm of 1703. The Great Storm of 1703. Britain's deadliest natural disaster. When people in Britain speak of the Great Storm, they often mean the devastating tempest of October 1987 that brought down 15 million trees and claimed 18 lives. Yet that modern catastrophe pales beside the disaster that struck nearly 3 centuries earlier. The Great Storm of 1703 remains the deadliest natural disaster in British history, claiming between 8,000 and 15,000 lives in a single night. The storm struck on November 26, 1703, according to the Julian calendar then in use, equivalent to December 7th today. It was an extratropical cyclone of extraordinary ferocity. Contemporary witnesses struggled to comprehend its power, and modern estimates suggest winds exceeded 80 miles per hour across southern England, reaching hurricane force in some areas. War context and maritime congestion. Before the storm, the timing could not have been worse. England was at war with France, and the Royal Navy had expanded to meet the demands of conflict. By 1703, there was an unprecedented concentration of naval and merchant ships along the British coast. Merchant vessels traveled in convoys for protection against French privateers. Large groups of ships lay anchored at Milford Haven, the Downs off Kent, and in the Humber estuary. A fleet had also gathered in the Solent. Strong westerly winds had been driving ships back toward England, while preventing others from leaving port. By late November, harbors and anchorages were dangerously congested, a floating traffic jam waiting for disaster. Rising winds and atmospheric warning signs. November 26, 1703. The storm did not arrive without warning, though meteorology as a science did not yet exist. Bad weather had been building for days. From November 24th onward, continuous gales battered the coast. On November 25th, the wind continued with unusual violence throughout the day and night. By Friday, November 26th, it raged so fearfully that few dared venture outdoors. William Derham in South Essex recorded barometric pressure falling to 973 millibars, the lowest he had ever observed. As evening approached, the wind rose even higher. When darkness fell, it created a hoarse and dreadful roar, like thunder, carrying terror to every ear. After midnight, the gale swelled to such force that sleep became almost impossible. Geographical path and intensity of the storm. The storm formed in the Bay of Biscay before racing northeast toward the British Isles. By the evening of November 26th, it crossed into southern England and swept over the Midlands during the night. Severe gales struck Cornwall and Wales in the early hours of November 27th. Within just a few hours, violent winds tore across central and southern England. Gusts in London and Bristol may have reached 100 to 120 miles per hour, while much of the region endured sustained hurricane-force winds. The most destructive phase lasted only 6 to 8 hours, but in that short time, it unleashed devastation on a scale Britain had never seen before. Naval disaster at sea, Milford Haven and Goodwin Sands. The maritime losses were catastrophic. At Milford Haven, the storm struck a convoy of more than 130 merchant ships and their Royal Navy escorts. By the following afternoon, 30 vessels had been lost. The most devastating scene unfolded at the Goodwin Sands off the Kent coast, long notorious as a graveyard of ships. Royal Navy vessels including HMS Stirling Castle, HMS Northumberland, HMS Mary, and HMS Restoration were driven onto the sands. Over 1,000 seamen died there alone. HMS Mary was lost with nearly all hands, including Rear Admiral Basil Beaumont. HMS Restoration lost its entire crew of 387. In total, 13 major Royal Navy warships were destroyed in a single night, along with more than 40 merchant vessels, a staggering blow during wartime. Destruction on land. The devastation across the countryside was unprecedented. In the New Forest, thousands of oak trees were uprooted. Across Kent, fallen trees lay in rows like regiments cut down in battle. In London, around 2,000 chimney stacks collapsed. Westminster Abbey lost part of its roof, and church spires across the capital were damaged. More than 400 windmills were destroyed, some catching fire as their sails spun uncontrollably in the gale. Across southern England, towns including Plymouth, Portsmouth, and Bristol suffered heavy damage. Hundreds of homes were blown down nationwide, flooding and agricultural devastation. Storm surge compounded the destruction. The Thames rose to levels never previously recorded, destroying thousands of homes along its banks. Ships in the Pool of London were thrown together like matchsticks. In the West Country, particularly around Bristol, flooding drowned hundreds of people and countless livestock. Vast areas of farmland were contaminated by salt water, and tens of thousands of sheep and cattle perished. Ships were blown extraordinary distances. One vessel was driven 200 miles before grounding on the Isle of Wight. Another was found miles inland. Human stories. The human dimension of the catastrophe was stark. Queen Anne and members of the royal family were forced to take refuge in the cellars of St. James's Palace as chimneys collapsed around them. Bishop Richard Kidder of Bath and Wells and his wife were killed when chimney stacks crashed through the roof of their residence. Yet there were acts of courage. In Deal, Thomas Powell organized the rescue of sailors stranded on the Goodwin Sands, offering rewards to volunteers and helping save around 200 lives. Meanwhile, the first Eddystone lighthouse off Plymouth was completely destroyed, killing all 6 occupants, including its designer, Henry Winstanley. Royal Navy losses and strategic impact. The loss of 13 major warships and thousands of sailors was a devastating blow to British naval power at a critical moment in wartime. This was not merely the destruction of ships, but the loss of experienced officers and seasoned seamen, men whose skills had been forged through years at sea and could not easily be replaced. The economic damage was estimated at £6 million, an enormous sum in 1703. Yet the financial cost was only part of the impact. The strategic consequences were far more serious. For a time, Britain's ability to project naval power was severely weakened. The protection of trade routes became more difficult, convoy systems were disrupted, and the Royal Navy's deterrent strength was shaken in the midst of conflict. In a single night, a storm had achieved what enemy fleets had failed to do. It had crippled a significant portion of Britain's maritime power, religious interpretation, and national response. The disaster was widely interpreted through a religious lens. In an age when scientific explanations were limited, many turned to faith for answers. The Church of England declared the storm to be God's vengeance for the sins of the nation, a divine warning delivered with overwhelming force. January 19, 1704, was proclaimed a national day of fasting and repentance. Churches filled as sermons described the catastrophe as a judgment upon moral decline and spiritual neglect. For many contemporaries, the storm was not merely a natural phenomenon. It was a moral reckoning, a moment when heaven itself seemed to intervene in the affairs of the nation. Comparison with the storm of 1987. The Great Storm of 1987 struck southern England with winds of up to 100 miles per hour, killing 18 people and felling millions of trees. It has often been described as the worst storm since 1703. Yet the scale of destruction and loss of life in 1703 was vastly greater. The earlier storm lasted longer and claimed thousands of lives in a single night, a toll unmatched by any subsequent British weather event. Conclusion: why it was called the Great Storm. The storm of November 26, 1703, represented an unparalleled catastrophe in British history. Between 8,000 and 15,000 people died. Naval fleets were destroyed. Towns were shattered. Forests were flattened. It occurred in an age without forecasting, emergency services, or organized disaster response. People faced the full fury of nature with little warning and few means of protection. Because of its unprecedented intensity, staggering death toll, and lasting impact on the nation, it became known simply as the Great Storm, a defining moment in Britain's history. History is full of storms, some of wind, some of war. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and join me as we uncover the moments that shaped the world we live in today.